Well, essentially, we're sitting in what used to be known as the children's sitting room upstairs. And the thing that I most remember about this room was I spent as little time in it as possible. I only stayed in here when it was raining. When it wasn't raining, the whole farm was our playground. And we wandered over the whole farm. We wandered down Schweitzer's Creek and up in the hills into the Ferguson Place and down through the caves. We wandered everywhere. And when we weren't wandering on foot, or I myself, I had a wonderful old horse called Red. And I used to spend a lot of time riding him, as well as a lot of time in his stall in the barn. I loved him, I brushed him, and then I'd sit on a bale and watch him eat his hay and oats. And of course we raised little orphan lambs as well, so sometimes I would sit and feed an orphan lamb with a bottle and still watch Red. That was the kind of thing that, that I remember about my childhood. This room was a room where you came when it was raining. And if there were friends here, which I often had friends, lots and lots of friends here, so this would be our starting base. And the thing that we would do would be leave this room and crawl on our bellies through the whole house, all the way down the stairs and through the kitchen and the dining room and everything else, and back up the back stairs and back to here. That was the end of the end place. Who got there first? And then, if it was still raining, my English governess, Nanny, had a wonderful game that we played, which was, we called it Spider's Web. And you'd tie a string to a doorknob, and you'd have the whole roll of string, and you'd just tie it to everything in the room until you really were so entangled in the web you couldn't get out. And then when that got worn out, we played Monopoly and Mahjong and things like that. And when I was alone, I remember we had a gramophone or a Victrola or whatever we called it in those days. And I put on records, and I loved ballets. I used to play a lot of ballet and dance. And sometimes the dancing would get downstairs. We'd dance with the whole family in the hall. Sometimes I'd dance by myself up here. My favorite, I think, of all was Firebird. And when I got tired of that, I would lie down on that sofa over there and find a book. And then I would...
No shortage of books in this
house. No shortage of books in this house. And I would immerse myself in fairy tales. Grimm's fairy tales and the books of Oz, Dr. Dolittle. That is how I remember this place. It was a whole world, and you could spend, hours just beside the creek down there. You could spend hours just playing and pretending. I think children live in a really imaginary world until they get to be about 12 years old. Everything can be imagined. You can imagine yourself as being Dorothy of Oz, and you can go wandering through the pastures down there and imagine that you're going to be blown away to somewhere, I always felt that way, and I was never lonely. Sometimes we went with our father. Other times we just went by ourselves.
Mm-hmm. My grandparents lived near Lexington, mm-hmm. and they had horses and things like that. Mm-hmm. We loved spending our summers there. It was just like you said, it was magical. There was always neat things to do.
Well, horses, all animals are a wonderful thing to teach you responsibility, because animals, after all, are completely innocent, and they're completely dependent on us. And that was the one thing that always was inculcated in our minds, that we had to be responsible and see that our animals were fed and watered and taken care of before we could come in. in the afternoon. We always had to look after the animals.
And I think that living in the city, you lose that, the being in the cycle of nature and being close to animals and
Yes,
the land.
it's amazing, you know, and of course, you don't realize it until you see how much easier it is to bring up a child on a farm than it is in the city. On our own farm in Brazil, our children didn't have to go to all these lessons and all these different things to keep them busy, you know. Maybe they were deprived, but they were out there and they brought their friends out and they made their own games and they disappeared off into the woods and had a wonderful time.
They didn't have to have television or video games or all
No,
that stuff.
they really didn't have that kind of thing. They used to go camping and all the rest. And of course, when they got older, they got a little bit naughtier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then, only years later, did they tell us what they did.
After they reached the age
Right.
of 12.
the age of enlightenment.
Well, I think that's one of the things that attracts people to this place. It is to me, just that lifestyle. I mean, you know, you want to live that, but for whatever reason, people or their kids, they don't have a choice of where they live, and they see something like this, and they just imagine what it would be like with the animals and the ponds and all that kind of stuff.
Of course, it was easier in town in those days, too. I don't like to be always going back because I think that's horrible, but it is a pity that they took the sidewalks away. And it's life is so much more confined for children than it used to be because, among other things, it looks to me as though there's nowhere you can walk. I mean, you can't walk because there's no sidewalk.
They want you to walk in the mall.
Well, or in the mall, right. And if you do walk, you feel like you're a lunatic escaped from asylum or something like that. So it isn't easy.